now that you are with a view that's a bit different than being part of the chamber, what is your sense here in terms of the chances we get a deal in the near term?
Well, I'm a little bit pessimistic here. I think one of several things has to happen. Either number one, public opinion has to start turning against Speaker Pelosi. And so far it hasn't. I mean, the numbers have pretty well stayed fairly constant throughout this debate. And she has pretty well rhetorically painted herself into a corner, even if she wanted to negotiate. And let's face it, this isn't about policy anymore. It's about the politics of the 2020 presidential election. And frankly, it's visceral. It's visceral against the president. Had anybody else attached their name to his proposal for border security, I think the thing would have flown through by now. And let's face it, $5 billion in a $4 trillion budget is probably a rounding error. The other thing that would have to happen to bring this to a conclusion is to have the moderate Democrat voices, and you hear them a little louder today than you heard in the last couple of weeks. They would have to have their way. They would have to put their foot down and say, we absolutely insist on these negotiations. In the 16 years that I served in Congress, I never found them to be a particularly potent force in the chamber, so I'm not terribly optimistic there. Last but not least, the president still probably has the ability to declare a national emergency. For policy purposes, that may be a good thing since I agree with his policy, but for process, it's bad. It sets a terrible precedent. He probably has the power to do this, but for decades, Congress has been pouring more and more power over to the executive branch. I don't think it's good for democracy, and I think as conservatives, we would rue the day if he exercised that. So at least 2 votes in the Senate is progress, but it's far from a solution. It's far from being settled. And I guess I agree with Larry Kudlow that in the long term, this will have minimal impact on the economy. But in the short term, it's going to start affecting things.
Yeah, well, in the long term, we're also all dead. I mean, at this point, you know, if this thing keeps going on, we keep using this term, uncharted territory. I mean, we're in uncharted territory already. Are you getting any sense? I know you're obviously not actively in public office anymore in terms of the impact in your home state or in others. And do you have any sense as to the longer term implications if this continues as you seem to think it will?
Well, I'll let you know. I'm supposed to be on a plane bound from New York to Dallas later this afternoon. We'll see how that works out. But, you know, if you're one of the families that's living paycheck to paycheck and you're a federal worker, I mean, this has a huge impact on you. It's probably reaching crisis proportions, but I salute the TSA people who still show up for work. But for the vast amount of Americans, this really hasn't impacted them. But I got to tell you, if the airports start getting clogged up, companies can't IPO, if we can't get aid to farmers through the ag bill, you know, the list goes on and on. Sooner or later, this is going to impact real voters out there, and they will have their voices heard. So I still think the impact has been minimal, but I think we're on the precipice of real American families outside of those who work for the federal government to start feeling the impact of this. And, you know, I know the president's put 4 different proposals on the table. So far, they all seem to be dead on arrival with Speaker Pelosi, and we'll see if public opinion changes to where she would want to go in and negotiate, because I think a big deal could be had here. We all know it.
You think a big deal could be had? You really do? Like, I mean, a big deal on immigration?
Oh, I'm just saying, it's theoretically.
What do you mean?
It's theoretically possible that this could happen. I'm not betting on it. I'm certainly not going to bet my firstborn on it. But it could happen, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. There would have to be a pause of some sort, and there would have to be some good faith negotiations. And so far, Speaker Pelosi doesn't want to negotiate at all. I mean, that's pretty clear. And the public polling data or her moderates haven't sent her in the direction of the negotiating table.
What do you make of people who say, well, she's not negotiating because they're busy passing bills in the House to fund the government a la carte first?
Well, again, it takes at least 2 parties not to agree. And at last I looked, the Senate hasn't necessarily agreed with the House position, much less to get a bill to the president's desk. But this is what Congress does under Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. It appropriates money, and so far it hasn't appropriated that money, so it hadn't even gotten to the president. So we have to also look at the fact that the House and the Senate haven't agreed.
Yeah, well, the president did have 2 years where he had control of both bodies. He didn't seem to get anything done then on his wall.
Well, I don't agree with you. I mean, as you well know, most measures in the Senate take 60 votes. So I'm not sure, unless you have 60 votes like the Democrats had when they passed Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, I'm not sure I wouldn't characterize it as control. I'd rather have a majority than not a majority, but particularly when it comes to appropriations bills, that takes 60 votes in the Senate.